Hey everybody, this is John J.R. Robinson for OnlineLessons.tv. I'm going to talk today about fine-tuning the drums. We've already tuned the drums and we've gotten them, they're pretty close. And I'm just going to actually play it with my finger. Massive. And what I've done is we've got a snare head on, and I've actually played it for a while. So I tune the snares off, and you can literally, with your finger, you can kind of check what's like lower or higher. And sometimes, sometimes I'm not always looking at that perfect scenario about pitch, because and certain songs may demand maybe a lug or two I detune for that. So what I'm doing is I'm basically matching. I'm going to hit the snare drum. And of course, it's quite ringy. So I'm going to keep it that way for 1 second. And the nice thing about the mag throw-off from DW is I'm kind of in a middle position with the snares being medium tight. Just loosen them. And now let's go to the super tight. Kind of really brings everything together. But what I'm going to actually start in the middle position, and I'm going to use just a little bit of muffling and see what it does. And it kind of brought everything back together. So for example, now for me on this particular groove, I'm going to muffle it down just a little bit more. And I use these slap clats. There's an array of things you can use. You can use duct tape, a wallet. There's all sorts of stuff. I don't like muffling too much because then things become a little more pointed and stiff. Now it's got exactly what I'm looking for in a snare drum. Now, again, all right, so I'm going to switch over to a ballad. I'm going to flip the mag switch. That's like, or maybe kind of a sloppier rock tune. Very nice on the DW snare. So again, fine tuning now with tom-toms, I finger check. And generally the pitch comes from the bottom head. And so far, I like what's going on here. Depending on the room you're in, you might get some sympathetic vibration or frequencies that are triggering certain toms, and they could trigger back into the snare drum. So, I have my toms in this particular situation wide open. If I were to slightly muffle them, it tightens up. But I'm choosing now, because of performance, is to leave them wide open. And they're really big. So, let's just take a look at this one real quick. See, when I lower it a little bit, it opens up the shell, but it does then affect the snare drum. And in my position, I would rather feature the snare drum than the tom-tom. So what I'm going to do is kind of fine-tune that just a little bit up again without choking it too much. And then if you find yourself that you are choking it, what you have to do is go to the bottom head. And you got to fix this by bringing the bottom head up slightly. And there's a point of the size of the drum where you can only tune the drum so high without it not, being you know, the sound of itself. So and I got a nice bend on this one. And what I like to do, you know, initially is once I stretch the head and put it on, is I tune it up actually higher than the bottom head, but not finally. In other words, I want it to seed and feel comfortable on the rim, on the wood rim. And then once that's done, I'll stretch it again, and then I'll detune it back so it has a slight bend down. Now, if I were to bring this up, you can already hear it's choking. But the beauty about DW drums is that you can really get away with that. And I'm going to back that down a little bit. Now, finally, for the bass drum, and it depends on, you know, you can start in the order. I just happen to start with snare drum today, but on a bass drum, and I'm using a bit of a larger bass drum, it's a 24 by 18. I make sure, and it's got a Remo P3 on it, I make sure that the head is not flapping. You know, in the old days with certain bass drums, you had to do that to actually get the sound out. But in the DW world, they sound so beautiful. So I check the lug, and generally, I am not, from the bass drum, tuning by note. Toms, I will tune by note or intervals. But this one, I'm actually tuning by tension on the bass drum, and it's making sure that nothing's loose, nothing's flapping. You know, we haven't, you know, shipped the bass drum, or it's been hauled somewhere, and all of a sudden the lug's off. And then we do the same thing with the front head, and it's fairly equidistant. Sometimes you can loosen the front head a little more, and sometimes you can tighten it. It depends on the venue. I prefer not to run the bass drums wide open. So there'll be some sort of a DW packing blanket, or, you know, back in Los Angeles, I will use a packing blanket just barely touching both heads. So, and I'm sentimental with an old Rufus sandbag that just sits in there. So, this has been John J. Robinson for OnlineLessons.tv, and I hope you enjoyed this one. We'll see you soon.